So we're broadcasting now with Art Papers Founding Stories, and we're waiting for people to file in as attendees join us. You know, we'll get started in just a minute, but we're going to do a little bit of a welcome and then a little introduction. And so now that people have had a little bit of time to join us and to get added on to the webinar, I will introduce myself. My name is Sarah Higgins. I'm the editor and artistic director of Art Papers. And welcome to Founding Stories, or Oral Histories of Grassroots Atlanta, presented by Art Papers in partnership with Meredith Cooey, who is here with video off and will join us later for Q&A. Founding Stories is made possible in large part by Emory University's Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Books Library, and is supported by Georgia Humanities in partnership with the Georgia Department of Economic Development through funding from the Georgia General Assembly. So this discussion is the third part in a 5-part, 2-day symposium, which takes a decade-by-decade look at some of Atlanta's DIY, artist-run, and grassroots art spaces. The series is focused on beginnings, the events and broader contexts that led to the creation of these spaces, the opportunities that allowed them to come into being, and the challenges that had to be overcome in doing so. Right now, we're joined by the founders, co-founders, or those closely involved with the genesis of projects that began in the 1990s. There will be some time for questions from the audience in the last 30 minutes of this panel. You can submit, if you're in the audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll use that the chat function to provide information and links for the audience, but so be sure to keep an eye on that window as well. You also can post questions to the Q&A section at any time during the panel, and we'll get to it when we get to Q&A. But you can also put a thumbs up on a question that you like rather than repeating it, and that way it'll get a bump up to the top. Each panel in this series is moderated by a member of the community who experienced these initiatives firsthand, and in several cases, who operated or participated in concurrent projects. For this panel, we're really pleased to welcome moderator Chad Radford. Hi, Chad. Chad Radford is a music writer and editor. His work has appeared in Athens, Georgia's weekly paper, Flagpole Magazine, Creative Loafing, Atlanta, Signal to Noise, Mass Appeal, the Chattanooga Pulse, Art Papers, which is dear to our hearts, and more. His most recent work includes hosting interviews for a cappella books here in Atlanta with music-related authors. He's currently editing Smithsonian Folkways recordings, forthcoming anthology of hip hop and rap. He also runs the website radatl.com. So Chad, I will hand it over to you before my dog starts barking louder, right? And I'm gonna show a little slideshow as you introduce everyone else.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start with our panelists. And on my screen to my right, there is Rachel Pomberg. Rachel has over 20 years of experience in arts and, my screen just did something. Let me go back to where I was. Okay, let me start over. Rachel Pomberg has over 20 years of experience in arts and culture, higher education, and animal welfare. She has led marketing and communications initiatives for a wide range of nonprofit organizations, including the Field Museum of Natural History, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Best Friends Animal Society. And Rachel is one of the original founders of Eyedrum Arts and Music Gallery. Hello, Rachel. Then we have Ed Woodham. He is the founder and director of Art in Odd Places and was the co-founder and director of 800 East from 1990 through 1997. Ed has been active in community, art, education, and civic interventions across media and culture for over 35 years. A visual and performance artist, curator, and educator, Woodham employs humor, irony, subtlety, detournement, and a striking visual style in order to encourage consideration and critical engagement with the urban environment. He created Art in Odd Places to present visual and performance art in public spaces in New York City and elsewhere. And to my left, we have Kelly Teasley, whom Kelly, along with Maggie White, co-founded Youngblood Gallery in 1997 in their home. The gallery relocated twice to Grant Park in North Highland, eventually closing in 2012 after its 15-year anniversary show. Kelly then changed career paths to focus on her next passion, which is animals, and currently works with the Atlanta Humane Society. So happy to have everyone here. Looks like we're all a bunch of animal lovers. I have to keep my door shut so my cats won't get involved and ruin the interview. And I've heard various dogs in other people's videos throughout the day as well. So, well, with that, how's everybody doing?
Good, thanks.
Good.
Good to have you here. Rachel, I want to start with you. You were one of the founding members of Eyedrum, one of the original Eyedrum 8.
That's correct.
So if we could just sort of back up a little bit to say circa 1997, which is right around the time when Marshall Avett and Woody Cornwell had a loft downtown on Trinity Avenue that was hosting parties, and they realized that they had kind of tapped into an underserved scene. And so Eyedrum was kind of born from the Silver Ceiling. But I was wondering if you could start by giving us a little bit more about the circumstances that kind of surrounded your world back then when Eyedrum was founded.
Sure. So as you mentioned, Marshall and Woody shared a loft space on Trinity Avenue. And after living there for a few months, they started Silver Ceiling. And it was really, I think, a unique time, not only on that side of town, but also just in terms of what was going on in the arts and music community in Atlanta in the late 90s. And there was a group of us that obviously were, friends with Marshall and Woody. A lot of us had started having conversations around, what is it that we could do more? Could there be a space that we could create to really sort of fill a gap that we decided was really there within the Atlanta art and music community at that time? And so lo and behold, the space next to the Silver Ceiling opened up. And I think there was a framing tenant in there that had recently left. And we gathered the small group of 8 of us together, and we made the decision that we were going to go ahead and take control of that space and rent it out and create, an alternative to the arts and music, community, create an alternative, opportunity, if you will. And just see how it goes. And that's really how Eyedrum started. And we all had day jobs and we spent all of our own personal money. We were totally self-funded. And but we launched it and it took off very quickly. And it was a pretty amazing start to what is now a 20-plus-year-old organization.
Now, you mentioned you wanted to create like an alternative space to what was already out there. Did it seem like there was an underserved community of artists and musicians that were sort of working outside the parameters of music that sells a lot of beer?
Yeah, I think so. I think for both visual artists and performing artists and makers of all kinds and musicians, Atlanta has a really strong and deep cultural community, but a lot of those institutions and venues were fairly traditional. Not to say that that's a bad thing or that they shouldn't be supported, but if you're a starting artist and you can't get gallery representation, where are you going to show your work? If you're a musician and you're starting a band or you're a solo performance and you can't get booked in a venue, where are you going to play? And so we really felt that not only was there an underserved community that we could provide a venue for, but we also wanted to bring in things that were maybe a little bit more left of center, or a little bit more non-traditional, and introduce the Atlanta community to things that maybe they just haven't seen before, haven't heard before. And so that was really, I think, the premise of why we banded together, because we all had a common interest in filling that gap. And we all recognized that we had connections and networks and the energy to bring it all together into one space. And we also felt that it was really important that the space be very community focused, that it wasn't something that was built out of a traditional structure or hierarchy, that it really was a community space that anybody could come in at any time and participate in any way, shape, or form that they wanted to.
Ed, let's move over to you and let's talk about the history of 800 East. Can you give me a little bit of background on kind of what the circumstances were surrounding your world when you started 800 East?
Sure. Thanks everybody for making this happen. Before I begin, I'd like to just quickly dedicate my participation in this panel to Steve and Ronog Seberg, who are, for me, and continue to be beacons of what a true artist is. And Steve just celebrated his 90th birthday, so happy birthday, Steve. And also rest in power, Ronog, Donna Drake, Bob Riley, and Tim Monteith, who've gone on. What was going on back then, as I've just had the time since being invited to now to think about what was happening then, it was, there was war was going on, crack, and war and crack, and was one other, and I can't remember it, but it was the downtown Atlanta where we were was like a really intense period in that area where 800 East is, which is now the lower, is it the 4th Ward?
Yeah, I guess that's what they call it.
Right, that's what they call it, the 4th Ward. So Bill Morar discovered the space. I met William Morar, and he was at an earth factory, and at that time, there were spaces that were going on, Little Beirut by Normando, New Visions Gallery, Clang for music, and Young Hewley Gallery. So there were smaller spaces, but there was no really large space for people to gather. So William found the space after having a conversation with him at one of the mattress factories, and then he knew Neil Freed, and so the three of us banded together and we founded the space. And it's very similar to I guess what Eyedrum mission was also, that there was just this need for, there was no space where emerging artists, independent artists could gather. And I guess one of our missions was to have a place for marginalized communities to produce and gather.
So you saw the need for, I mean, you said marginalized communities. That was an underserved element of the arts world back then.
There was many underserved, I think, because a lot of different people besides just artists came and used the space to produce their events.
And we're talking about 1990 here, correct?
Right. 1990, but late 1990, and then moving right into 91, which is when the Gulf War started. And AIDS, that was the other one. It was AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. There was crack, really prevalent in that location, actually. And then the war started in 1990, the beginning of 1991. So it's like now, it's very fraught with a lot of intenseness.
Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right.
Let's move over to Kelly and let's talk about Youngblood. So, you know, Eyedrum and Youngblood kind of formed around the same time. We're talking about 1997 here, which is around the time when, Ed, you sort of brought an end to 800 East and went up to New York. But we'll move back over to Kelly. And Kelly, maybe, yeah, tell me a little bit about what the circumstances were. Like what compelled you to start Youngblood?
Basically, I had just graduated from college and had graduated for a painting degree. So I was really, excited about moving to Atlanta and starting kind of my art career. Quickly discovered that there wasn't a lot of spaces for young and emerging artists. It was mostly commercial galleries. So going through that process of showing slides back then and having to show all that and being kind of discouraged about what my options were. I had a friend who also lived in Atlanta that was working at the High Museum. She was an artist as well. Maggie and I were really involved in the music scene as far as going to house shows back in the 90s. That's where we went and saw all of our, punk rock and hardcore music shows. They were all in people's houses that they lived in, and warehouses that they lived in. So being really immersed in that culture and seeing those kids who are, in their young 20s, putting together these events where a lot of people would come, and we said, well, why can't we do that with art? So the house we lived in the West End, it's a fairly new house. It had just happened to have the living room that was full of just tall ceilings and white walls. So we decided we moved all of our furniture out of that space and put it into the garage. We didn't know a lot of artists. Like I said, my friend Catherine that worked at the High Museum, she started putting flyers up at ACA because she was right there. And we basically just had a piece of paper by our phone, and people would call and say, hey, I'd like to be, involved in an art show. And we just start taking people's names and phone numbers. And then, everything back then, we had no internet, we didn't have email, things like that. So we spent a lot of late nights at Kinko's, making flyers and postcards for our shows. But it was very much born out of that scene of the DIY music scene, for sure. We just sort of kind of replicated that, put flyers around town to find artists and have people come to the shows. Most of the early shows in our home were all group shows. We used to have like a theme. We'd have a size theme or some sort of title that everybody worked around. And that's how we met a lot of our artists. And we had shows out of that space for a couple years before we moved.
So you took the DIY aesthetic of punk rock, house shows, hardcore, and channeled it into this this kind of very similar venue, but for more disciplines.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and a lot of the people that we would meet at these shows were also visual artists, and so we also wanted an outlet to be able to show our work in a sort of punk rock way of doing whatever work we want to make, whatever ideas. We didn't really, at that time in the beginning, we weren't looking at people's work. It didn't really matter as long as they were enthusiastic about it. As we went on for 15 years, we were doing more curating as far as types of artists, but in the beginning, it was definitely free for all. Whatever we can fit and whatever people show up with is what we hung.
And did you have sort of a moment where you sort of realized that this is much bigger than you had anticipated and had to move it out of your house into a proper location?
Yeah, it basically got to the point where we got tired of moving our furniture out of the living room every couple months, and having, hundreds of people in your home and having things get messed up and people spilling wine and all this stuff. I also really wanted a studio space of my own. So we looked around for a new space. We found it in Grant Park, which is, I still actually live across the street from the old space. And over the last 20 years, the landscape has changed a lot. When we moved in, it was an old TV repair shop. We renovated it ourselves and split up. Half of the section was artist studio space, and then the other part was the gallery space. And basically it was a way for us to be able to be open so people can come and look at the work, not just on the opening night. That was another issue with having it in our house. We couldn't just have people come after the opening. So being able to have a space where people could come and look at the show after the opening. And then, just kind of creating a separate space from our home.
Now, did your perceptions about Atlanta change, or about the kind of the scene that you were serving change as you moved into this new venue?
I think so. I mean, the first time, the way we started, I had this feeling of there wasn't any other spaces that were, which is really naive of me to think that there wasn't a lot of spaces at that time that I knew about. First time, when I first met Rachel, I think I met her brother first, and it was at Dottie's, and I was passing out flyers, and he was like, my sister's starting a space just, just like yours. And so I was like, wow, there's somebody else out there. So being able to finally slowly connect with some of these other places, after a couple years into it, a few other places started popping up, and we started to try to build some coalitions with each other, where we would have meetings every month and kind of talk about what each other were doing, and kind of help try to promote each other. So that was a really awesome time to kind of be around everyone and try to, build a scene together, instead of there just being like, this is my spot, like actually trying to collaborate and help support each other for sure.
How about you, Rachel? Did you find that your perceptions about Atlanta and the scene that Eyedrum was catering to changing as Eyedrum became an established institution, so to speak?
Yeah, I think my perceptions changed pretty early on. I think we all sort of approached it from, this was the world that we knew, as Kelly mentioned. You didn't know about other spaces, you didn't know about other artists or musicians, you just kind of had your own little world. We had the benefit of 8 people who were connected in various ways and shapes and forms. But I remember when we first opened, we had our first art show, and we started off doing like art shows like once a month, and then we increased the cadence there. We started with our first art show, and I think probably there was 25 people there total, including the 8 of us. So, it was very small, and it was a group show. But within the first 2 months, we had 2 more art shows. We had a variety of different types of music performances. And we went from 25 people at the first show to over 200 people by the 3rd show. So it was really very impactful on me in a very positive way, because there's this old saying, if you build it, they will come, right? Mm-hmm. And we really proved that out. And not so much in terms of having a number of bodies coming through the door, but it really demonstrated to me that what we were providing as a collective to the community of Atlanta was really needed, because people were responding, and they were responding very, very quickly. And that, I think, really shifted my perception in a very positive way. Not that I had a bad perception about the community in Atlanta, but it really, went from something being fairly narrow to being something that much more broader, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk about 20 years or however many years it's been after the fact. I think my perceptions of Atlanta were shaped by Eyedrum. As I was new in town, I somehow was asked to start volunteering at the door there. And I was brand new in town and knew nobody. So I met Stan Woodard, I met Randy Castello, I met Nisa Hormuz, Robert Cheatham, and all these people who kind of were my liaison to Atlanta. So I would say that Atlanta, like, I don't know, I don't want to go on a tangent here, but Eyedrum was a very good entryway into the arts for Atlanta, because there was such an intersection of just every discipline you can think of. I remember doing the door at a fashion show there. I remember seeing my first Gold Sparkle Band show there. Mm-hmm. I remember I was like, I guess I'm into jazz now. From Iowa, and yeah. we had indie rock and punk rock and country, but I had never really experienced like a free jazz explosion with 14 people in that basement playing horns before. So
yeah, it was I think one of the beautiful things about Eyedrum is that it was such a multi-use space. Mm-hmm. And that was informed not only by the interests of the people who founded it, but more importantly, as we went along, more and more people such as yourselves, such as Robert Cheatham, such as others, became more involved. They might not have been founding members, they might not have been paying the rent, they might have, but they helped. And they helped by booking events, they helped by painting the walls, they helped by showing up, they helped by spreading the word, they helped by passing out flyers. And that, I think, is really the foundation that we were hoping that Eyedrum was really going to build and establish. And I think because Eyedrum is just celebrated its 20th year, and continues to evolve and has gone through many different machinations of however it's looked. And I, wasn't around for a lot of that, so I was in Chicago, but it it still sort of, I think, relies on that core foundation that was established very early on, and I think it's going to continue to build and grow.
So Ed, we'll move over to you. And I will say, since signing on to do this interview, I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole of YouTube videos that are out there for 800 East and the different events that you were involved with. And it's kind of helped fill in the gaps for me for a lot of the perceptions that I've had about Atlanta. You know, as I was explaining to Rachel a minute ago, kind of my introduction to Atlanta was through Eyedrum. But kind of the deeper I went into these different arts communities, I would encounter these characters like Neil Freed or Grady Cousins or people like that who really had this performance art kind of aesthetic in everything that they did. And that's something that I've picked up on as I've been studying the history of 800 East and Art in Odd Places. But you know, kind of with bearing that in mind, how did your perceptions change when you started establishing 800 East as a presence in the city?
Well, I mean, my perceptions were not really, I was fairly new coming back from, I was coming back home from New York after being in New York from 1980 to, maybe 88. So when 800 East started, I didn't have a real clear, I was brand new. And so I didn't have a real clear perception of what it was, just that there was a need from going to the smaller spaces, that there was a need for larger groups of us to gather.
And you were involved in the art scene in New York?
On more of the periphery, I would say. I mean, I worked in some of the spaces that a lot of the people that I had when I would come back to visit, like RuPaul and Lady Bunny and a lot of the more underground club scene, all migrated. When I came back to Atlanta, they all migrated to New York. So we sort of exchanged places. So more on the periphery than I was after I came back in 97, 98.
Okay. But you saw there were certain there were certain things that were influencing you that you experienced in New York that you wanted to bring to Atlanta. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, there was I guess a space where many different people could gather, not just visual art, not just musicians, where there could be this influence between all of the media that people were experimenting with. And I just created a sort of a safe space, but not just for artists, but also for other people that were just felt marginalized and had communities. The women's community, the gay community, there was a bisexual community. There was just different communities, and so just creating a safe space where everyone could come together in larger events. And one of the shows that I remember most is the fashion show, where there were different people, like I think it was called Fifi Mahoney's, or some other places, and some designers that would present fashion, but then there were performance artists that would explore the runway as a stage, and musicians who would explore the runway as a stage. And a strong remembrance from that period is an artist, John Levy, who had hung a television. It was right when the war started. It was like the beginning of February, and he had hung a television with snow showing, and he had draped a mink stole around the television, and he'd written "war" on it. So that's, and Steve Seberg did a performance piece during the fashion show that he burned the White House.
Yeah, earlier I was mentioning characters like Grady Cousins and Neil Freed, but the Sebergs were a couple that I met when I was fairly new in town, and fascinating, absolutely fascinating artists, fascinating people.
Who have continued to, when they left a huge impression on me, and really have been a major mentors and inspiration throughout my whole career.
Yeah, you mentioned the word community. I think that that's kind of the key to all of these things. And again, this kind of links us back to the punk rock, hardcore. At least for me, that was community was always the most important part of that. It was, and there was always this element of what are you bringing to the table? Are you starting a venue, a zine? Are you in a band? Are you an artist? What do you got? And I think that's kind of an important part of everything that we're talking about today. Kelly, I'll talk with you for a minute about one of the memories that stands out the strongest in my mind from Youngblood was the final show, the We Love Atlanta show, with all of the photos that everybody, I mean, talk about a community effort. There was a lot of material there that that stands out for me. But I wanted to ask, you know, if not that show, are there other shows that you curated with Youngblood that really stand out as kind of some of your best memories from those days?
I think most of my favorite shows were the group shows that we did. Um, where we had some sort of theme, like when we had, We Love Atlanta was an awesome one. Any of the skateboard shows, the Day of the Dead shows, the ones where there was just like a lot of people involved, and a lot of people like wanted to be involved, and a lot of people wanted to come and check it out, and people were always really excited about those shows, especially the ones that had like some sort of working theme that everybody could work on. We had some really amazing artists that come through, and a lot of the ones that we would do solo or paired shows with would still come back and be involved in the group shows as well. One of the last shows we had was like our 15th anniversary show, and going through and contacting all the artists that we had worked with over the last 15 years was amazing. And I had people that, had shown work with us, in the very beginning, and were sending us stuff, and they were a lot more established than they were back then. So knowing that they still had some kind of love for us, and it would still, send a piece for us, even though it was worth a lot more money, and probably could have done better, at a bigger space. It was really great to see everyone who over the years had kind of a part in Youngblood, and that we had a little bit of piece of them, in their hearts over all these years, even if we hadn't contacted them in the last, 15 years or so. I think definitely those are probably my favorite ones, was the one where we had as many people as possible to get involved in the shows.
And Rachel, when you look back at your time at Eyedrum in the early days, or at any time, do you have specific shows or specific programs that really stand out for you as being particularly special?
Well, I always really liked the group shows because we could, Eyedrum, the original space of Eyedrum was massive.
Mm-hmm.
Huge, really high ceilings, huge space, had the creepy red basement underneath. You're basically underneath the street, you still use that space too. But I think my favorites were always the group shows. I think one of my most favorite moments was when we had our first fundraising art auction. And we were about a year in to Eyedrum, and we just put out a call, because by that point we had done more shows than I think anybody physically felt we possibly could have pulled off. And we just put out the word, and we had tons of submissions, people donating artwork, to raise money for Eyedrum. And, the house was packed, and we had, the gallery was run, everything was hung gallery style. And we started the art auction, and nothing was happening. Nobody was bidding. It was like crickets. And I was like tracking everything. And I was just like, this is not good. This is going to be a total fail. And I don't know what happened, but I guess my inner Vanna White came out, and I just jumped up and I started moving the work off the wall and like walking it around the room. And once we started doing that, then people got really into bidding. And I think
nice.
that it was kind of a crazy little event, but it was our first major fundraiser. We weren't even an established nonprofit at that time, but the sheer amount of support, not only for people that had donated work for the auction, but the number of people that came out and the amount of money that we raised I think that to me was the moment when I realized that this is actually real and this is happening, and it's making a positive impact on the community, and we're actually doing it, you know, after trying to figure it out and not really having a plan. This is actually coming together, and we got a lot of support. And I remember driving home with a bag full of cash in my car, and I was like, oh boy, what are we going to do now? You know? But I think that was probably my favorite moment.
Now, so those are highlights for sure. Do you think that there are lessons that you learned from then that maybe artist-run initiatives that are operating now could benefit from?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, at least that, you know, for myself, that I learned. The first is that collaboration is a very difficult thing. People use the word collaborate all the time. We throw it around. I'm guilty of that. But collaboration is a really beautiful and positive thing, but it's also very challenging and difficult. And it doesn't matter if you're collaborating with one other person or 6 other people or 15 other people. It can be a very delicate dance. And when you have people who are connected by a common mission or a common goal, but have differences of opinion or have different agendas, and just the sheer fact that we're all human, there can be times when collaboration and working in that way and trying to make decisions and make things happen can be very challenging and very difficult. And what I've learned from that, which I think is a good lesson for, you know, new artist-run spaces, no matter how big of a group it is that you have to be an active listener, and you have to, you know, take the time to carve out a space where you can think and talk and share and workshop and debate and disagree and agree, but not lose your humanity or your respect or your thoughtfulness, your compassion or your empathy towards the other people. And sometimes you're going to be successful at that, and sometimes you're going to fail at that. And that's okay, because that's just part of the process. I think the other big takeaway for me, which was something that I struggled with for a while, is that, you know, when we started Eyedrum, we were committed to it being an open space. You know, we didn't have a board of directors. None of us had titles. It was just, we're all in it together. We're going to figure it out. We're going to, you know, make decisions as a group, and, you know, we're each going to take turns and whatever. And that worked fine for a while, but then it started to create some, let's call it, some beautiful chaos. And so I think it's okay for people that are starting out and, or, you know, existing organizations that might be struggling with this, or, you know, new spaces or new groups, that it's okay to have conversations around roles and responsibilities. It doesn't have to be formal, but there should be some clear framework there. It can be a loose framework, but there has to be some kind of structure, because if there's not, what will happen is that you will end up in chaos. And then that's when things really start to kind of unravel. I think Eyedrum, you know, after the time that I was with the organization, experimented with a lot of different shapes and forms as to creating a structure. And I think they're continuing to evolve in that. And I think you see that in a lot of different organizations as well. But we didn't start with that, but I think the environment of Eyedrum, especially with the infusion of more people coming in to help and trying to get involved, forced us into creating some kind of framework.
Very well. I kind of want to get Ed and Kelly's thoughts on this, but we'll go with you, Ed. Can you think, when you think back about your experiences with 800 East, how do you think current artist-run initiatives could benefit from the lessons that you learned or your experiences?
Well, 800 East was never a organization, for one thing. It was I would consider it more of a project, which is also sort of the route I've taken over the years, is not to form any sort of organization or 501(c), but more of a project that's connected with the 501(c). So I would say, on a just sort of a different take, is to don't wait to be recognized by institutions or the press or the academia. Don't wait for grants or money or brick and mortar space, and don't wait around to think that you need something that you don't have, that you have everything that you need, and that it's important to just realize that you do have everything, and just go for tenacity, consistency, and just to keep doing what you want to happen over and over and over again until it takes root. And to be independent, and to just, for me, it was to remain a project, to not be an organization, to that way that way it was able to remain not beholden to any sort of organizational structure or money, and we were able to just do whatever we wanted to do, and people could come in and do whatever they wanted to do. So that was really important.
So remaining nimble and always keeping that ability to adapt.
For this particular project, I mean, I think that different structures or different ideas have different sort of routes. But for this particular project and projects that I work with, I prefer more flexibility and more independence. So it's not beholden to any sort of institution or any sort of grants or any sort of censorship.
And current projects, meanings, your activities with Art in Odd Places.
Right, it continues to be completely an independent project. And
you have more projects coming up with Art in Odd Places in 2021.
Right. We couldn't do a show, or we decided not to do a show this year. And that for that particular show, there's, there were with, I mean, I think you talked earlier about, I know you talked earlier about other projects that stood out, and projects, just real quickly, because I'd be remiss at not mentioning some of the, I mean, what made 800 amazing was the collection of people. And I think probably all of these faces, it was not just a few people who maybe did the organizational part of it, but really the entire community that came together. And some of the people that made things, or that were important shows, was Anthony Owsley, who created the cartoon show. And that was a yearly show, the fashion show, each year with a different sort of person that would head that up each year. Wayne Sizemore, a really important person for Art in Odd Places, did the Naked People show and a show called Homo. And then Homo was led by Todd Schaefer, and Steve Seberg did the Children of Abuse show. And then there was Women on Fire with Alice Lovelace, Lynn Linnemeyer, the ones I can think of, Julian Helms, Julie Newton, among many others. I'm sure there was a question there somewhere, but I wanted to make sure I got those folks in, because they were so important. And there's so many other people too.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Kelly? Are there certain experiences that you can look back on that you think current artist-run initiatives could benefit from the knowledge that you gained along the way?
I mean, I feel like most of the knowledge that we gained along the way was kind of by mistake, doing it wrong or right and hoping that it works. Everything that Maggie and I did, we just figured out our way. We had a problem and we're like, how are we going to figure this out? And we would just do it, starting from, like I said, our house, and to moving to a bigger space, and then trying to move to a more foot traffic space, trying to find ways to support the gallery by opening the shop that we did after we did the studio space, getting other artists involved to help us do the flyers, going from Kinko's to getting Graphic Havoc to help do the flyers, to, finally we were able to get into technology in the end of our existence, so we could actually have a website, and incorporate social media. Since as we grew up, Maggie and I grew up during this whole process. If you can imagine, like over the last 15 years that we did this, we definitely changed. And but I think our roots were always the same, and it was basically that we can find a way to do this ourselves, and if we can't, we can definitely get other artists or other people that really want to support us and help us get the word out. We learned how to write press releases and try to get newspaper people, art critics like Felicia and Jerry and Kathy Bird, all come out and write about us so that we could at least get some publicity and so people would know about us. Stuff that as we grew up, we learned that we had to actually, if we want to have a business, we have to actually do businessy type of things, like sell artwork and get a credit card machine and, you know, like I said, do press releases and things like that, that, you know, were more adult that we didn't know how to do, but we, you know, we went down and sat down at the bank and said, how do we get a credit card machine? You know, stuff like that, so that we could actually function and be able to, you know, have the space survived. I mean, Maggie and I had other jobs until probably the last 5 years of Young Blood. So juggling that space, we learned we needed help in the space. So we figured out a way to get interns. We, you know, contacted the local colleges and said, you know, do we have interns that want to come and hang out at our space and let people come look at the artwork and answer questions? So, you know, we just had to think of creative ways to fill in all the spots where we could, in order to keep the space open that long.
So it seems like the takeaway from this conversation is going to be that community is key, being involved. Sometimes the art of collaboration is a delicate one, but it's essential when we're talking about community, but also being able to navigate chaos. I think all three of us have sort of touched on, or all three of the panelists, I should say, have kind of touched on those elements that have tied us all together here. So Meredith is probably going to be coming in here pretty soon to start with the audience Q&A. But I will keep going here for a few minutes. And Kelly, if we could just continue for a minute. You have been working with the Humane Society. How did your experiences with Youngblood kind of sort of inform your work with the Humane Society?
Well, you know, after we closed Youngblood in end of 2012, beginning of 2013, I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd been very involved in the, you know, art scene for so long. It was pretty much part of my life. So switching gears to something else I was scared, and it was really hard to do. But I think moving into animal welfare is the same sort of thing. It's a passion, just like art was. And so, you know, when I was involved in Youngblood, art was consuming of my life. I, you know, also, you know, made art myself, and then, you know, being involved in, you know, hanging all the shows and promoting all the shows and getting all that experience. It was pretty much my day-to-day life. So now, you know, that I've switched kind of gears into a career path, I think I've taken that same passion that I did with art and just moved it into animal welfare and being, you know, involved as much as I am with them. And their foster department is what I do. So getting, you know, focus on getting animals out of the shelter is what I do. So that pretty much consumes my life, just like it did when I was involved in the art scene.
And Rachel, how have your experiences in this sort of gritty downtown Atlanta arts and music scene, this punk rock world of chaos, informed your work as in marketing, and you work with animals as well with the Best Friends Society?
I did, yeah. I'm no longer with Best Friends. But I think what has been constant through my career is I've had the privilege of working across, I guess, multiple community groups. So for example, when I was overseeing advertising and marketing for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, I was working very closely with scientists and curators and people who studied like one type of squirrel for their entire life, and that's like all they knew. At the school, obviously working with artists and students and instructors and the dean's office, the student affairs office. So, you know, what I took from Eyedrum and learning how to work alongside with people from different backgrounds, different interest groups, different knowledge bases really has propelled me through my entire career and has afforded me to be able to work for some really interesting organizations. You know, anything from, especially, you know, as Kelly will know, working in animal welfare, that's a very intense industry and community. There's a lot of love and passion and commitment, and you know, you're dealing with volunteers, you're dealing with adopters. You just have to be able to kind of navigate all of that, and you find the same intensity in art schools, as you do in museums, and as you do in artist-run spaces. And even though Eyedrum was not a formal organization or a large organization, everything that I learned going through that experience really helped me navigate these really old traditional organizations that can be a bit restrictive, but also have a lot of opportunity for creativity.
How about you, Ed? Did the experiences that you've kind of went through with 800 East and with what you're still doing with Art in Odd Places, have those sort of given you some sort of insight or an advantage in your professional life?
Well, it's showed me that, and I guess that there's a little bit more difficult these days, but there's a common thread between drag queens and skateboarders and punk rockers and rednecks and activists and classical musicians and maybe already said punk rockers, but there was a common thread between all of us, then in that we all could be in the same space and make art and have a good time. And I still, when I do art residencies at different places, I still look for that and still try to make that happen. So that's sort of what was my takeaway from 800 East.
Very nice. I see that Meredith has joined us. So I guess we're going to go ahead and start with the audience Q&A. Is that correct?
Yep. And for those of you that may not have caught the instructions at the beginning, you can type in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But I think maybe I'll start. There was this discussion about like bridging lives, right? Like different sectors or whatever. And we have a few questions from Michael Kilburn, but I think I will start with one that is to all the panelists. But starting with you, Ed, he asks, also given the collaboration between 800 East and the High Museum with Row the Boat, could you and all of the rest of the panelists talk about the interface between high and low art in the city at the time?
Well, in my case, with that particular collaboration, there was not a history for me to have a high-low art collaboration. So it was approached it with trepidation and with a sense of humor and with a lot of patience and with critique, with institutional critique afterwards. And probably that was formed during as well, but I waited till afterwards to give critique, which was, there was some meetings afterwards, but it was not, I don't think there was a lot of history there because, so that's my answer for that. It was a difficult road.
And what about you, Rachel or Kelly? Sort of that relationship between the highbrow and the lowbrow, and how that is within Atlanta, maybe at the time, or what you're seeing, like when you're leaving the spaces.
I don't really recall thinking about that at the time. Obviously, as I mentioned early on, there were your traditional galleries, had their stable of artists, we had the museum institutions and things like that. But I don't recall, and at least I can only speak for myself, that was even a consideration for Eyedrum, to either make that distinction or to go one way or the other. We had artists of all calibers show, and from all genres show. Some of them have gone on, I think, to getting gallery representation. Some of them continue to, make their own work in their own space and in their own way. But that, from my recollection, was never something that we considered or thought about or really kind of put our energy into. Because for us, it was really just about, if you want to show, then, here's a space that you can use to show. So, I was gone from Atlanta for quite some time, so I can't really speak to how that's evolved, over the years. But I think, again, for us, it wasn't, at least for me in particular at Eyedrum, it wasn't anything on my radar.
I think for us, when we first started, it was definitely what I saw in the art scene was either commercial galleries that were showing pretty tame artwork that was very easy to sell and could go, wherever. And I was really looking for a place, even if it was a commercial gallery, that was showing more unique work, that was showing more experimental work, that was like having some sort of say or something. So I think what kind of birthed out of our space was to be able to show that type of work. And even as we grew and we became more polished, I would say, we still stuck with that sort of art. We still stuck with the type of art that, even though it may be presented a little bit better now, it's still the type of work that was different than what you were used to seeing. Was a little more I don't know, exciting to us, and maybe part of whatever culture was happening at the time, or had a message to whatever was happening at the time. I still feel like the work that we showed, as far as Atlanta, didn't really have another place. Like, I feel like even towards the end, when we had more successful artists, I'm not really sure where they would have shown in Atlanta. There was definitely some other cities like New York or LA or San Francisco, this type of places that had more commercial galleries that had, buyers that would buy that type of work, more successfully. But in Atlanta, even if they moved to another type of space that maybe had a higher buyer market, I don't think that there would be a space for that. I mean, most of our, if you think about it, our buyers for the art that we had in the gallery were just like us. They just happened to get older, and so they actually had jobs where they could now buy artwork. So it's almost like the buyers grew with us as we grew older, and then they became more established like we were, so they were also able to buy the type of art that they want to buy. So we just kind of stayed, I feel like, in the same community, and every now and then we'd have kind of someone from a more established space dip in and say, oh, what are you guys doing? This looks really great, and kind of try to be part of that. But I feel like even throughout the time, we still stayed with the same people.
And I'll actually follow this up with a question by Joey Orr. And since we've been talking about community so much and things like that in the conversation, he asks, is there something about the DIY and independent space that caters to your broader political or social perspectives of the world? And that's for anybody.
Money. I mean, the other spaces are about the bottom line margin. I would assume it's about making money, and 800 East was not about. We didn't sell art. We presented art, so that was, and we didn't really worry about. I mean, we had a little bit of money coming in through the studios, and that would fund. So we weren't beholden to any admissions at the door or any grant money or anything. It was so I would say money is a big factor.
Can I chime in here for a second? These three institutions existed in the 90s, and I think that the arts climate was a lot different back then. As part of this conversation, we've talked a lot about community and punk rock in particular. And with particularly my experiences at Eyedrum, I saw a lot of music that could physically harm you. And I saw artwork hanging on those walls that involved bodily fluids. And there was a culture of contempt back then. Ed brought up money, and I think that part of the sort of punk or the post-punk aesthetic was to exist outside of money or in defiance of money. You know, within the last decade, you've seen a lot of sort of corporate entities like Red Bull and things like that starting to throw money at art projects. In the 90s, people would talk about selling out, and that was a motivation, was to exist without, you know, intervention from a higher level, be it highbrow or lowbrow art, or any kind of, it was, and this is my perception of it, but it was art that existed in defiance of highbrow opportunities or things like that. You know, like I said, when I went into the basement at Eyedrum, there was a certain fear factor involved, that I knew I was going to have like a very visceral experience. But you know, like I said, I saw extreme harsh noise and free jazz, where I recall one show where somebody threw a cinder block into the audience and people had to scatter. And I mean, that was what you wanted. And it was kind of, it was like a badge of honor to sort of exist outside of what the rest of the world sort of deemed acceptable. And I think that kind of goes back to the first question, maybe more so than the second question, but I think that they're connected. I mean, there was a culture of contempt, I think, that a lot of outside art was coming from. And I mean, if you want to expand on that, Rachel, if you think I'm wrong or if I'm right or anything like that, please feel free to chime in.
Well, first, I'm sorry you were afraid to go to the basement, but then again, there
No,
are times that I was afraid to go down to the basement too.
I went down there willingly. It was, you know, when I moved to the South, I had read a lot of William Faulkner and Walker Percy, and I was looking for this sort of, you know, phantasmagoric Southern experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it at Eyedrum. And a lot of that involved sort of stepping outside of my own comfort zone.
Yeah.
In the name of having my mind blown.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely times where I was pushed out of my comfort zone. I think, you know, I think we didn't start Eyedrum to make money. You know, yes, you need to have money in order to run a space, and we figured out ways to do that. Mostly, you know, primarily, almost always through donations. But it wasn't a forced donation. It was like, if you can give us $1, if you can give us 50 cents, if you can, you know, give us $2, we'll give you a beer and a red Solo cup as a donation while you're there. And you know, like as Kelly mentioned, like we got creative and we figured out ways to do that. But I think the thing about Eyedrum in this particular time was that we really did embody that DIY ethic, and we were able to have a space where it was no holds bar. You know, that was kind of the point, because people need a space in order to do this type of thing, and work is you know, artwork and music is a form of communication, and people communicate in different ways. And I think the thing about Eyedrum, whether you had a show on the main gallery or you're down in the creepy basement, it provided an environment for people to express themselves, and in a way that was inclusive and was safe and was welcoming. And if you didn't like it, you could leave. You know, it wasn't like you paid $10 to see something and then you were pissed off because you didn't get your money's worth or whatever. You just had the ability to freely move in and out of you know, the venue. And I think that's one of the things that really kind of set Eyedrum apart, and you know, is important in artist-run spaces, is to have that sense of inclusivity and to be willing to stand up for people who are looking for a place to express themselves and they can't find it in more mainstream or traditional venues, whether it's brick and mortar or not.
We have another question from Michael. He mentions the Olympics. And so I know that we at Art Papers are really curious about knowing your experiences with that event here in Atlanta. How did it produce any certain impact on the work that you were doing? Or, I mean, that's when a lot of, cultural displacement was happening as well. And Rachel, you're talking about providing space for communities, right? Giving voice. So we're just wondering about the impact of the Olympics and what that might have done to the projects.
Well, Eyedrum started after the Olympics, so there was no, crossing of paths or, overlapping with when that event was here in the city and when we started Eyedrum. So I don't necessarily know if there was a direct impact in terms of influence or not in regards to what we do with Eyedrum. I will say that section of Trinity Avenue was desolate. We had this huge parking lot. I mean, there was no traffic. There was, God only knows what we could have done and gotten away with that we didn't already get away with being out there in this very isolated space. So, I mean, one could possibly make an argument that the Olympics had some kind of impact on that from a geographic perspective. That area is very highly gentrified now. But I don't think that there's a connection, at least from my recollection or my perspective on that.
Well, I think we decided at 800 East to stop after the Olympics. So we decided after the Olympics, okay, that's it. We're not doing it anymore. But Art in Odd Places began during the Olympics as a project that began really by the Arts Festival of Atlanta and with the Individual Artists Coalition, and sort of led by Lisa Tuttle was an important part of it. And it was based in Little Five Points. Art in Odd Places was the first year, and then the second year was down in downtown Atlanta. And soon afterwards, the Arts Festival, I think that was the last year I was in Atlanta, and that was also the last year of the Arts Festival. So there was some impact there, I guess. I'm not sure exactly what happened in that case. I don't know the history of the Arts Festival, but so Art in Odd Places was sort of a response to local artists did not have any representation in the cultural Olympiad of bringing other people in, and this was our response to say we would like to be represented as well. And then Art in Odd Places really, and it was funded, but then I've sort of reinvented Art in Odd Places here as a different iteration beginning without any funding, and more political and more without permissions. In Atlanta, there were permissions, and here there are no permissions and no permits.
Can I ask why it was that you decided to stop doing shows at 800 East after the Olympics?
It was just a different climate. The city seemed to shift or change. There was just this shift of it. Just, I guess it's one of those evolutions that just sort of to fizzle out. But I'd have to do, I guess, more thought. There were exactly and more investigation with other people what their remembrances are. But for me, it was just there was this shift of the outside world had come in and not it had changed it. I don't know, some, I'm sure some for the better and some for the worst. I mean, it's when artists come into a neighborhood that is in the Fourth Ward was a crack-riddled, desolate, dangerous neighborhood. And so the artists came in and we changed the neighborhood for the good in the beginning. And now, it's when gentrification comes in, is that for the good or for the worst? It's hard to say. I would say often for the worst in that particular situation. So it's a difficult, in the beginning it was a more safe space after a while, but then the realtors came in and changed the whole area.
It's the most expensive piece of in-town real estate you can find.
Okay, there you go. All because of the Olympics.
And we have a question from Lisa Alembic, and it is geared towards Ed, but I think I'd like to hear from all of you. We'd like to hear from all of you. She says, Ed, your programming helped form my vision of what an arts venue role can be, of engaging the visitor by pulling them into the fray. With your experience of art in odd places, living in New York and keeps moving, and being a Southerner, could 800 East have taken place anywhere else? And could your vision happen today? So I guess, you know, thinking about maybe the placeness of Atlanta, the economic conditions of Atlanta, that particular decade.
Hey Lisa, it would be hard to imagine it taking place anywhere else because that's where it took place, and there's a certain irreverence and a certain sense of humor and whimsy and a take on life that Southerners seem to embody. And I'm a Southerner, so and I was coming home again, and I was running from New York because I was a queer running from AIDS, and it was the AIDS epidemic, and of course it was everywhere, but I had to get out of ground zero, and so most everyone I know from that whole circles of people in New York are no longer with us. So came to Atlanta, and I mean, I still feel like, even though I'm back in New York, I did the best work that I ever did, working with this collection of people. That because of it was affordable. I mean, our rent was, you know, for 10 acres and 2 buildings was $400 a month. And it was like, it's hard to imagine doing that. I'm sure that, I mean, there's other places that things like that could happen because I've seen documentaries about other places during that time. But for me, I couldn't imagine it being anywhere else, Lisa.
I can talk to it a little bit. Just I feel like it can still happen here and it can still happen in other places. I feel like just listening to the panel before mine that came after us, you know, one of the things as we kind of went through our growth spurt is meeting other spaces when they would start to open up and they would say, you know, we were really inspired by you guys. We started to open this, you know, place because you guys did it. And I'm sure the people after them are looking at their places now and use them as influences. So I think as long as there's a few people that are still trying to create these sort of spaces, they can keep passing it on through, as you can see through this whole entire talk we've had, kind of passing it on to generation to generation. And yes, it'll change as far as, you know, technology, and especially now with COVID and everything. It's definitely going to morph and change as it goes through time. But I still feel like the same roots and the same goals have gone through the whole time. And it's basically, you know, you can do this yourself. You can start this, and you may start really small and it gets, you know, gets to be bigger as you meet more people. But as long as you keep at it, meet more people to get involved, then you know, once it's your time, you can pass on that influence to someone else, and it just keeps going throughout time. I will say, you know, when I was younger and through my 20s and 30s, would go and, you know, visit other cities and look for similar spaces to ours. And, you know, that was kind of a mission. What was the first thing I would do anytime I would go to a new city or, you know, to travel, is to look for that kind of place. And I feel like in most places I at least found, you know, 1 or 2 places that were similar to what was happening in Atlanta. So I feel like it can happen anywhere as long as someone's there to make it happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you know, artist run spaces or DIY spaces or whatever you want to call them, you know, they're happening, have happened, continue to happen. They're taking new forms, pop-ups, and as Kelly just mentioned, they're going to continue to evolve, especially with COVID and things like that. I will say that, at least for me personally, the Eyedrum experience was very unique to Atlanta when I was there. I think it's still unique to Atlanta. I think the format can happen in other places. I remember when I was living in Chicago, you know, I would visit different types of galleries, different artist run spaces, different mixed use spaces. And, you know, I would walk in and I would go, oh yeah, you know, we kind of did the same thing. We did the same thing, but the feeling wasn't the same. And I think that's what's really special about, you know, Eyedrum, about Young Blood, about 800 East. It's just, there was just this feeling that was unique to the Atlanta community. And my hope is that in other cities, those communities are having that same unique experience, but I don't feel that I would ever have the same experience that I had at Eyedrum. And I'm probably biased in saying that because I was one of the co-founders and was very obviously intimately involved in the space and in the starting of the space. But I think it's okay for communities to have those kind of unique experiences. I don't think it needs to become something that's cookie cutter, because then it's going to lose its magic no matter where it is.
And we have another question from Grace Kim. And so we've talked a little bit about finances and money and stuff and hating money, maybe. But she says, there's been a lot of discussion on the pros and cons of an organization's structure, of the organization's structure roles interfacing with what activities it was pursuing and what financial circumstances they were dealing with. I'm curious to hear the perspective of these three different perspectives. So, I mean, she also asked Rachel about the decision to turn Eyedrum into 501c3 and, you know, what kind of led to that, creating a different sort of structure. And Ed, you know, you talk about it being a project and staying nimble and things like that. And Young Blood, you know, maybe making work at affordable prices. So just thinking about the different sort of financial considerations for the different projects. Yeah, if you could just speak to that.
So I'll go first. Eyedrum, and give me the fact that it was 20 something years ago. Eyedrum when I was with Eyedrum, we had just started having conversations around whether or not to pursue a 501c3 nonprofit standing. I had left the organization prior to that being implemented, so I can't speak to what happened in between all of that. I feel as if we started having those discussions because the programming was getting bigger. The space was being used more and more. We were needing more things. And, you know, there is a benefit to being able to apply for grant money. And you can't really do that without being a 501c3 establishment. So, you know, funding is, while again, wasn't the driver for when we started Eyedrum, it is something that is necessary in order to, you know, to do what you want to do, especially when you have people who are paying out of their own pocket to maintain the space and run the space and rent the space. And, you know, that's not sustainable. So I think, you know, the exploration into establishing Eyedrum as a 501c3 organization, at least in my mind, had a lot more to do with its sustainability than its profitability. And those are two different things.
Yeah, I think we had a little bit different perspective from the others just because we were trying to survive off, you know, the selling of artwork and renting of studio space, or the selling of items from our shop. You know, when we first started, it definitely it was a dream to keep it, you know, self-sustaining, but it really wasn't why we started doing it. I'm pretty sure first couple of years when we had the house shows, we didn't take a cut of the artwork or any of the sales or anything like that. Just went to the artists and kind of asked all the artists to bring like a food or drink item to the opening. That's kind of how it worked. when we moved into the place and space in Grant Park, we had a little bit of support from the artist studio rental next door, and then that kind of evolved into the boutique, which had handmade items, and that's kind of how that started, was to try to give supplemental support to the galleries, to having more affordable items, that everyday items that people still made as an artist, but that people could buy. And then we had to switch over to taking a percentage of the art sales. As we grew and moved into the new space on North Highland, we had to adjust even more and really think about the work, talking to artists about the prices of their work before we agreed to even do the show, to see if it was kind of in the level of what people usually bought work from us. And if we wasn't, we usually tried to say, well, you can have some bigger pieces maybe that are more expensive, but if you can make some smaller pieces that maybe our buyers would be able to buy, we would sell prints and things like that to help kind of supplement. So that's kind of, we built that in a way so that we could, the space could stay open as long as possible. Maggie and I, like I said, worked other jobs until about the last 5 years. So most of it, we weren't really living off the space until the very end, when we had to close. But it definitely, the heart of it started, with what we want to do. We want to still keep that theme, but you also have to think about, if you want the space to stay open longer, how you're going to financially support it, especially if you're not going to do a nonprofit, if you're actually going to try to survive off selling artwork. It was only Maggie and I, so it was only 2 of us. If it had been, a more collaborative group, like 7 or 8 people, we obviously wouldn't have been able to support those people. So, we just try to think of other ways that we were able to bring in income, having donations at the openings for drinks and things like that, in order for us to pay for the next drinks and snacks at the next opening. So, we relied on basically the community being able to support us by either buying artwork or buying stuff in our shop.
And I sort of have already said what I guess I feel about of this, but for me, it was others people's money, and other people's money often, in a great deal of cases, means that there's control, and then with control comes power, and then comes, usually right behind that comes censorship. So that was sort of, and there was, but I also think it's important that sustainability, in some cases, like for Eyedrum, Eyedrum continues to serve a public in Atlanta, which is very important. And but 800 East was not about that, really. It was more about a free space during a time, and for me, knowing that it would have a period of time that it would serve Atlanta and that public, and then it would sort of other organizations or other ideas and projects would come along after that, when that fizzled out. So sustainability wasn't a part of our equation, more so no censorship and freedom.
Can I add, as someone who volunteered at Eyedrum when they moved to the MLK space, you kind of watched as the months went along, walls would get knocked down and the space would get bigger, and that required build out, it required paint, and it was all done to serve primarily the artists who were not only running the place, but were also performing there. Artists need to be paid for their work. And I remember when Eyedrum was awarded the Warhol grant, and it was like a collective cheer went out around the city. And you saw the programming really step up, and you saw the organization really step up. I remember Robert Cheatham had invented this sort of tiered system of donating, or sort of what your involvement with Eyedrum was. And I think the bottom line is that, money is essential to keeping an operation like that going, and to keep growing and expanding. And the questions I think that came up after that are sort of what Ed was getting at, is that, and what you, Rachel, were getting at earlier, is that the collaboration, Eyedrum, the board, you kind of watched it just sort of expand and contract and expand and contract. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of heated discussions. And you saw those elements of control and censorship and things like that. Like maybe not in, you couldn't put it in those words specifically, but you saw that element of chaos sort of moving in. And it's a delicate thing. And I think that when Cheatham was there, Eyedrum was really going in the right direction. And it was clear from things like the Warhol grant coming their way and just the level of music and art that was going on there. It was directly related to the money. But, you know, it's the root of all evil.
So my appearance on the panel is an indication that we're reaching the end of our time. I don't want to cut anybody off if they have any last comments or responses to that. Thank you, Chad, for that. I think that synthesis at the end of that last question was really helpful. So don't let me cut anybody off. Does anyone have any last comments? Okay. So then it is left for me to thank you to Chad for being such an adept moderator, and to Rachel and Kelly and Ed, thank you so much for remembering that time, you know, kind of in this fishbowl sort of format, and for really your frankness and your thoughtfulness in reconsidering these things that you know, hopefully you carry with you a little bit all the time, but might not have done this much of a deep dive for a little while. Thank you to our audience for joining us. I know that this has been the most active Q&A of the day. Thank you guys for that engagement. It was really great to see you popping up in that space. And so thank you for your questions. The next talk in this series will begin tomorrow. It's the 1980s, and it'll start at 1 p.m. We're getting a little bit of a later start and have 2 panels tomorrow. The 1980s will be moderated by Lisa Tuttle, who was mentioned a few times in this conversation. And then it will be followed at 3 o'clock by the 1970s, which is moderated by Dr. Candy Tate. If you want to join us for those 2 panels or just pick up one of them, you can go to artpapers.org and go to our events, and there are links to register for the Zooms for those talks. And I have to mention that this conversation has been recorded, as have all of the talks in this series, and we'll be making these conversations, materials surrounding them, transcripts, expanded bios, more of the images that you guys have shared with us, all available on artpapers.org in the coming weeks. So thank you guys, everyone who's been with us throughout the day or who just joined for this one. We really have enjoyed hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.